So in this video, I want to talk about the factors involved in figuring out how far a lead climber would fall when climbing past their last piece of protection. So the first one is pretty obvious, which is just the total distance climbed past the piece of protection. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing, but notice that I can climb up past my protection, I can climb to the side of my protection, or I can climb kind of diagonal from my protection, right? There's all kinds of ways to climb past protection that aren't necessarily just straight up. But that's one of the first things we want to consider, is how far past the last piece of protection has the climber moved. The second thing we want to consider is that when the climber falls, how much slack will accumulate in the system as a result of the fall. So if a climber is right above their piece and they fall, all the distance between them and the clip is going to accumulate as slack. But if the climber is, for example, climbing to the side of their last piece of protection, if they take a fall, no slack is going to accumulate in the system. So right now we have the total distance past their last piece of protection and the total amount of accumulated slack. So that's two factors right now. The third thing we want to think about is how much slack was initially in the system. So when a climber falls, even if they're not generating any new slack from the fall, there might have been slack already in the system. Maybe the belayer gave them a little bit of extra slack. So that's one of the third things we need to consider, is how much slack was already in the system. So we have distance past last protection, slack accumulated as a result of the fall, the initial slack in the system, and then the fourth thing we want to consider is actually rope stretch. So if you generate a load, right, on a climbing rope, that can be a dynamic load, in which case there was slack from the climber fall, and that's going to apply a dynamic force to the rope, which is going to increase rope stretch. Or it's possible that with a tensioned rope, they fell without accumulating any new slack, and this would in fact be a, I guess my climber lost an eye, would be a static load on this climbing rope, right? There's going to be this pendulum effect, but the climbing rope itself experiences a static load, and it's going to stretch a little less. So when we're thinking about how far someone's going to fall, we want to think about what kind of dynamic forces or static forces are they putting on the rope, and how is that going to manifest in terms of rope stretch. And then the last thing I want to talk about is belayer displacement. So when the climber generates a dynamic force on the rope, or even a static force if the belayer maybe is a little bit lighter or gets caught unprepared, it is possible for the belayer to either get sucked into the wall or get sucked up the wall. And that's going to displace the belayer. Trying to show you my gree here. That's going to displace the belayer as the climber falls or as they swing or whatever. And so however far the belayer goes up or into the wall, generally speaking, the climber is going to fall that same extra distance. So just to sort of recap all the factors in play here. There's the distance past the last piece that the climber has climbed. There's the slack or lack thereof accumulated during the fall. There's the initial slack in the system. There is the dynamic or static stretching of the climbing rope. And then there is the belayer displacement, typically as a result of a dynamic fall, but can also happen in the case of a fall that is generating a static load on the rope as well.